Good morning, my name is Hannah Westbrook. Today I will be presenting my thesis exhibition titled Never Odd or Even, Finding Belonging in a Liminal Space. In case you didn't notice, the title Never Odd or Even is a palindrome, meaning that it reads the same forwards and backwards. My first name is also a palindrome. I've always had this special connection to my name. This symmetry reminds me of a number line, where each letter is like an integer, and the space between the two ends is the axis, or the origin point. And then the spaces between the other letters represent the infinite decimals between each integer. To me, this reminds me that my identity allows room for a variety of expressions, while also remaining true to myself and consistent. My body of work builds on the idea of belonging in between spaces. My research draws from my multi-ethnic identity, my ancestors' history, and growing up in a third culture. My paintings use abstracted self-portraits, color theory, and Gestalt principles to camouflage the face in the background, making it difficult for the viewer to distinguish a figure and its ground. This catches the portrait at a liminal state, which is a position that occurs on both sides of a threshold. In a society that favors extremes and tend towards polarizations, my paintings provide perspective and attention to the often overlooked, oversimplified, and more ambiguous realities that are equally valid in discussions about identity and belonging. For me, the idea of liminality is manifested in my biracial and multi-ethnic identity and my formative experience of being raised in a third culture while my family lived in Kazakhstan. My racial ambiguity has definitely had a profound influence on the way I perceive myself and how I'm perceived by others. My mother is Mexican American and my father is of German and English descent. Even though I'm an equal mix of both parts, my resemblance has changed as I've aged. When I was a child, my complexion was very fair and I had very light hair that was almost blonde. I was given the nickname Sarabalapan, which means yellow chick in Kazakh. Growing up in Kazakhstan, this set me at odds with my environment, whereas my mother was consistently mistaken for being ethnically Kazakh. However, as I matured, my hair and complexion have become a little darker, and my features have become more defined, so that I now bear a striking resemblance to my mom and her mother when they were my age. This transformation began as my family moved back to the U.S. from Kazakhstan, and I began to negotiate living in the Midwest in predominantly white spaces. Since then, I have been consistently confronted with the questions, "What are you?" or "Where are you from?" While I'm aware that this ambiguity has granted me privileges that other people of color are not given, these interrogations have caused me to wrestle with my mixed identity and nuanced upbringing. I experience this tension daily as I navigate the liminal space of being perceived as white passing or a person of color in the United States. The Hermetic principle of polarity states that opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. All truths are but half-truths. All paradoxes may be reconciled. An example of this principle is the way we think of temperature. Although considered to be opposites, heat and cold are actually the same thing. The distinction consists merely of a difference in degrees. Look at a thermometer and see if you can discover where heat ends and cold begins. That place doesn't really exist because the way we describe a temperature is relative to the degrees around it, hotter than this or colder than that. The same can be said about any other pair of opposites. In color theory, opposite colors on the color wheel are understood to be complementary to each other and are used to create harmonious color palettes. In these paintings, the color palette is pared down to achieve a lower contrast. What at first appear to be purely abstract color fields slowly gain comprehension as the portraits come into focus. The shapes that create the self-portraits are made by processing the source images through an adjustment filter called Threshold on Adobe Photoshop. This tool converts a full-color image to a simplified, two-tone black and white image based on a pixel threshold. Any pixels lighter than the threshold are converted to white. Any pixels darker than the threshold are converted to black. Information is lost through the process of averaging to the nearest extreme. The result is a graphic oversimplification of the original image, which lends a portrait that is fragmented and incomplete. I resonate with this idea of an incomplete identity based on my perception of my mother's Mexican-American heritage. Her family originates from Las Cruces, a city that has an eventful history with its borders. Originally, the land was occupied by Pueblo Indians living along the Rio Grande. It was then colonized by Spain, later became a province of Mexico, and then part of the Republic of Texas. After the Mexican-American War, the U.S. annexed the territory and it became part of what is now New Mexico. This shifting of borders and ownership had a tremendous impact on the trajectory of my family's history. Not only did it change our national identity and citizenship status, but it introduced the loss of cultural identity and added the pressure to assimilate to white normativity, while complicating the terms we use to define ourselves. In the work pictured here, the paintings depict a landscape alluding to the border wall between the U.S. and Mexico. All of the colors in this painting are the same value, and with a play on that word from color theory, I'm proposing a view of the border wall that was originally meant to divide people and places, as a site where equality is the reality, and no distinction is made between one side or the other. In fact, if one were to view this painting through a grayscale filter, as demonstrated here, the border disappears, and the viewer is faced with a blank gray canvas. These paintings ask questions about the function and necessity of borders, and what happens when we see beyond them and acknowledge the space they share. Similarly, in this piece, I'm thinking more about borders and maps, and how border lines are symbols for the idea that two places are distinct and separate. In reality, the lines do not actually exist in a physical sense. Most borders are arbitrarily drawn lines, rather than actual geographical features like rivers or bodies of water. Even in those scenarios, it is ill-defined who owns the water. In thinking of borders and the distinction between different approaches to the human experience, one side is perceived as more successful or inviting than the other. As the colloquial saying goes, the grass is always greener on the other side. This perceived difference inspires movement, and in that sense, borders are meant to be crossed. The question is, who has the right to pass through? It's the fear of the other that drives the need to exercise control over who can cross. It's the belief that the world would be safer if risks, ambiguity, and uncertainty can be controlled. This tendency is known as in-group and out-group bias in psychology. According to this theory, we group ourselves with people we perceive as similar to us and distance ourselves from people we perceive as different from us. We create a category for anyone who is not like us and label them as other. Racial prejudice is a poignant example of in-group and out-group bias at work. The bias lies in the fact that objectively, one race is not more valuable than the other, and race exists on a spectrum, so there's not a clear way to define and distinguish between black and white. As illogical as the bias is, however, it still functions in the perpetuation of racial stereotypes and racialized violence, expanding the divisions among society and leading to even more polarization. Another way to view this piece is explained by Gestalt theory. Gestalt is German for unified whole. According to the theory, the mind informs what the eyes see by perceiving a series of individual elements as a whole. When viewed from a distance, the viewer is able to connect the lines from one canvas to another and piece together a portrait. The imagery takes time and distance to become clear. The impatient viewer, and the viewer that does not step back to view the whole, might miss the imagery altogether. Returning to this piece, I just want to end by saying that I think it is worth our time to develop a practice of looking longer. I believe that we gain a fuller understanding of what it means to be human and to belong in the world when we acknowledge the ambiguity, discomfort, and nuance in the human experience that we often dismiss. The confrontation and challenge of changing our perspectives sometimes seems too daunting or too uncomfortable to bear. However, I believe it will only enrich our lives when we learn to see beyond superficial and oversimplified perspectives, and continually strive to see complex, gray areas and the infinite space that exists in between. Thank you.